Hello, my name is Sofia Salinas, and I will be sharing with you my change project, which was about implementing an effective positive behavior management system in upper elementary. I am the assistant principal for upper elementary, which is 4th and 5th grade in Colegio Menor Quito. This change project was inspired by a problematic that I found, especially last year in behavior management in 4th and 5th grade. The way I'm going to be presenting my change project is I'll start with an introduction on what the problem was that needed to be addressed, the hypothesis. I will follow with all of the research that I conducted, which was mainly focused on restorative practices, positive behavior management systems, and social-emotional learning. I'll continue with the methodology, what the plan was, and the steps that I took to reach the plan, as well as the results. What did the data suggest, and what was my personal experience about this positive behavior management system? And finally, the conclusion, which will be a self-reflection on my leadership style, as well as the next steps for this process. The question that truly inspired me for this change project was, how can restorative practices be implemented successfully and systemically across elementary teachers and staff? The reason why I started thinking about this question was there was a big problem that had to do with behavior management. It had become a big concern in upper elementary. This mainly had to do with the pandemic and the lack of social-emotional development in many of our students, given that they had been home for virtual school for 3 years. There was also an overall sense of lack of consequences, and this was felt from teachers and students, which unfortunately also led to non-cooperation and ineffective behavior management. What is the hypothesis? I believe that an effective and systemic use of restorative practices under a positive behavior management system will not only lead to clarity and alignment on system-wide procedures, and especially the hierarchical roles, who does what. I also think it fosters teacher ownership of student behavior management, particularly in class and outside of class. It also encourages accountability on behalf of students. It leads to continuity from one section of school to the next, at least if the positive behavior management system is done within the school parameters. And it would decrease major incident reports, both in frequency and in severity. The academic research that I started to do before actually developing the positive behavior management system I wanted to implement was to really delve deep in what restorative practices are. Restorative practices, they aim to restore and repair. They're not punitive, so punitive discipline tends to seek retribution by nature, and in that case it's less learning for the students. Restorative practices are also founded and built on student-to-student and student-to-teacher relationships. And I think this is a very important one. Restorative practices do teach. They're about teaching, and what they teach is conflict resolution skills that will be useful for students for their entire lives. I also wanted to look into what positive behavior management systems are out there, how they function. And one important part and piece of this work was understanding that restorative practices are simply a tool to create positive behavior outcomes. They're not a system. And when they're not accompanied by a system, it can lead to a lack of clarity on behalf of the teachers and the students. So I wanted to be able to develop a positive behavior management system that provided this clarity. It provided a concrete and structured system everybody could align to, but that it was also founded on restorative practices. Besides this, I also wanted a purpose to the system. And what I realized is that in academics, when we have standards or a scope and sequence, we have a purpose for the learning. In this case, I wanted the same thing. I wanted a purpose for the PBMS system and the restorative practices that were being implemented. And what I found was a social-emotional learning framework from CASEL that provided social-emotional learning competencies like self-management, self-awareness, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And these competencies can be targeted through the positive behavior management system and through the restorative practices that are used as tools to teach. This was the research that I conducted before starting the actual plan. The plan was to develop, to share, and to implement the positive behavior management system that, of course, needed to be founded on social-emotional learning framework, the CASEL framework, and on restorative practices. So the timeline for this was first to set the mindset and ask teachers for feedback. Ask teachers what they think was not working so that I could start looking at the development of the system in alignment to what they needed. This was done last year, starting June 2020, and it continued on our pre-service for this academic year in September 2022. Once I received feedback, I also started developing the system, considering, of course, our school code of conduct, and this was important to make sure that the system was in alignment to other sections of the school. This was done last year, June 2020, and up to July 2022. Sorry, I meant June 2022. Of course, then I needed to share the system with teachers once it was developed, and this also was done during pre-service of this academic year, September 2022. And what has been happening now has been the tracking of progress in terms of teacher buy-in, effective implementation of the PBMS system, frequencies of major incident reports. And this has been done for this academic year, which we've only had this first semester, September to January 2023. The first part of the plan was to set the mindset. And to set the mindset meant to give teachers first the correct perspective, that behavior was not personal, it wasn't targeted towards them. And second was that preventative measures are more important than reactive measures. So I gave teachers many tools to be able to create classroom environments that prevented incidents to even start in the first place. After that, I was able to share the positive behavior management system that was developed with restorative practices in mind under the SEL framework and in alignment to the code of conduct. And I was able to do this across several staff meetings with my teachers to make sure that the system was clear. And this was done pre-service before students arrived. Teachers were given a step-by-step plan to address any incident, especially recurrent incidents. They were given a matrix that aligned any incident to the SEL competence that needs to be developed and a bank of restorative practices to develop this SEL competence. They were also given templates to be able to contact parents in a way that communicated more effectively. I looked into the know, feel, do communication technique so that parents would also be involved in this process. And I also provided templates for meeting guidelines to encourage parent and teacher meetings. Throughout these couple of months that the system has been in place, I've collected some data from the teachers regarding the clarity of the system and the effectiveness of its use. This is just some of the data that I collected, but I thought that it was the most important one. For example, how are their general feelings about utilizing the system, the level of awareness their students may have of the system. Here you see that the vast majority of data points fall in somewhat comfortable or somewhat aware. So it's not extremely comfortable, extremely aware, but there is a general comfort and a general awareness in terms of teachers and students. Same thing for how often are you using the system, what part of the system are you using most frequently, what step are you staying in. So I was glad to see that there were many of my teachers that were using the system. However, most of them, if not all of them, stayed in step 1, which is just the restorative work with students. Step 2 has to do with communication to the house, parent-teacher communication, and I realized that that's not something my teachers are doing often. In terms of the effectiveness of the system, most teachers feel it's somewhat effective. And I also got some written feedback regarding what teachers feel and how they're using the system. Most find it somewhat effective with, of course, some constraints. For example, time constraints and constraints on how effective it is for recurrent incidents. With this feedback, I started the evaluation process. I realized that there is some teacher buy-in because there are teachers that find it effective. However, I identified some of the obstacles for teacher use, time being a big one, as well as not being able to know what to do when the incident with a particular kid is recurrent. Another experience that I have is that compared to last year, I have seen a decrease in major incident reports, both in frequency and in severity. Of course, this comparison is not as accurate as it can be since the school year has not finished yet. I think this process was very important for my self-reflection as a leader. I found that through implementing the positive behavior management system, I had to use both democratic and authoritative leadership styles. Democratic in terms of developing the system, looking at feedback from the teachers to develop the system, but authoritative once the system was in place, making sure everyone was following it by the book, which was something that was difficult to do, but that I feel needed to be done. Now I would definitely look forward to using more coaching leadership styles so that I could help the teachers that feel like they have time constraints or feel that the consequences are not enough for recurrent cases, to know how to use the system in a more effective way, as well as how to use restorative practices in a way that's meaningful, even in recurrent cases. I'm looking forward to implementing more coaching leadership for this system going forward. I think the next steps to improve this project is simplifying the system, simplifying the steps. Some teachers felt like it was somewhat clear, but not 100% clear, so I think simplification is needed. I also want to work collaboratively with teachers to add on to a restorative practice matrix that I already started myself, but that teachers haven't collaborated on, and I want them to be able to do this so that it is they feel ownership of the restorative practices that they can use in their classroom. I also think I need to improve the communication of the system to teachers and students, and I think I need to improve the tracking of alignment using the system, that every teacher is doing it the same way. This means section-wide meetings, reminding people of the system, as well as visibility. So I've printed out cheat sheets of the PBMS system and I've included them in every room. Of course, we also need professional development regarding restorative practices. That's a must always. But I do think that I also need to ask for continuous feedback, more feedback, so that I can continue adapting and I can continue seeing what has been working and what is no longer working and needs change. I thank you for looking at this presentation. I think this change project has been very inspiring to me, and it's created impact in my section. I think my teachers, my students feel more comfortable with behavior management now, and behavior management has shifted from punitive to restorative, which was the goal. Thank you very much.